Welcome to Big Rethink, brought to you by NewCities. I'm your host, Greg Lindsay. This is the episode for the week of December 7, 2020. The U.S. continues unchecked spread of the virus with more than 200,000 new cases daily in the United States. As of last week, more than 273,000 Americans have died from COVID, among the 1.4 million people worldwide. Now, my guest this week is MIT Associate Professor Sarah Williams, who's going to be here to discuss her new book, Data Action, Using Data for Public Good, which comes out on December 8th. So pre-order where all finer books are sold. But first, before we get started, I would like to acknowledge, as always, that I'm joining you today from unceded indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters in which I join you today, virtually. I would encourage you to go to native-land.ca to learn more about the territory that you are tuning in from. And this is particularly germane this week because here at NewCities, we hosted our inaugural conference, Higher Ground, looking at the issues of climate migration, sort of where people will live in a century of climate change. And this is particularly germane to our guest this week, Sarah, because one of our guests, as you can see here in Fireside Chat with NewCities Chairman John Rossant, was Sean Donovan, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, who initiated the Rebuild by Design competition in 2014 to rebuild from the effects of Hurricane Sandy. Sarah was a member of one of those teams, and she then in turn joined a team of architects at MIT, Rafi Siegel, Susanna Drake of D-Land Studio, who was another of our speakers this past week, to imagine the coastlines of New York and New Jersey in 2067. Sarah, of course, was a leader in the visualization of these efforts, and as we'll see in just a moment, Sarah is, of course, widely known as a mapping expert and was a formidable contributor to our team in particularly outlining the infrastructure systems that would have to be moved in the advent of higher sea level rise. Particularly, she was part of a team during Rebuild that looked at the meadowlands and sort of, how that would be reclaimed as a national park, and also which then informed our renderings, as you can see here, of Jamaica Bay, where we imagine in 2067 that JFK Airport's been reinforced, but the bay has been turned over as the sort of green heart of New York City here. But also, basically sort of she underscored in her work for Rebuild the incredible infrastructure systems that would, again, have to be moved. And this was a point that Jesse Keenan, a Rebuild member himself, when he was, before he joined Harvard University, also sort of underscored the fact that, planning for a century of climate change and sea level rise will require, billions, if not trillions of dollars of moving infrastructure, housing, and whatnot out of these floodplains. How would we reinforce these systems? And this is something that Sarah has thought quite a bit about. I don't know if we'll have time to get into it today because the data landscape is so much to cover. But also, Hurricane Sandy and the effects of that were covered in Rebuild also gave rise to the mutual aid movements, which I've talked about before on some of these episodes here. This, of course, was Occupy Sandy, which was a network of volunteers, which at its peak had more than 60,000 people working to deliver goods and supplies. And was an early case, along with the mutual aid networks that have risen today, of what we are calling open collectives. This is part of another team of architects at MIT, of which Sarah and I are also team members, that's going to debut her project and others at the Venice Architecture Biennale in May 2021 to look at historical examples of these open collectives, whether they are, kibbutzim in Israel or other forms of sort of, collectivist operations here to provide help and aid to each other. And also, she's one of the designers of our pavilion, which you can see in sneak peek form here. The guests will be able to sort of explore the history of these open collectives. But that's past and preamble. I want to get into discussing the book. So this is her book, Data Action. And Sarah, if you want to come on out here any moment, we'll turn the slides off and get started. So please join us on the virtual stage. There you are.
How are you?
Welcome, Sarah.
Nice to see you.
Well, congrats on the book. I guess to get into it, as a sort of opening point here, obviously your career with working with data spans all sorts of issues. For those viewers who have not had a chance to read or to read much about it, what is Data Action about? And sort of, what's your overall thesis on the evolution of basically big data for good? Because, I think high hopes of a decade ago have been dashed in many ways, but I'm glad to see you remain an optimist about what we can do with data and turn it back towards using it for social good.
Yeah, I think the book really started from the premise that, in the last decade, we created unprecedented amounts of data, and that's just set to grow tenfold. And autonomous vehicles being on the roadway is just one example. It's creating a digital world every single second, right? And this, digital world will be an alternative infrastructure. But there was so much excitement from Civic hackers, the open data movement, firms like McKinsey that are applying it for social good, and also sidewalk labs that's really imagining cities to improve the quality of life, thinking about data. And with that, I felt like there's always this pain on my side, right? Like on the one hand, right, these excitement, they didn't know how they're using data intentionally or unintentionally to cause harm. And while criticism started to mount about automating inequity or weapons of mass destruction by Cathy O'Neill or algorithms of oppression, there wasn't really anything that gave people a guide for using data ethically and responsibly, right? So while we're excited about it, and a lot of people might not have had the background of the ways that we can use it unintentionally for harm, there was no guide for how we could use it to do good. And so as an optimist, as you say, I really wanted to create, a corrective, standard to practice for big data enthusiasts, for data novices, for civic hackers, for planners, for policy experts, to give them kind of inspiration within all of this criticism.
Interesting. So yeah, I mean, can you talk a bit about some of your past projects and what you see as sort of exemplars of this? Like, I mean, of course, one of your most famous probably is the $1 million blocks, which basically showed, the price, the costs, the social costs and financial costs of mass incarceration, the carceral state. And, of course, this has been interesting as well because, it was data-driven policing that led to the stop and frisk policies of the Bloomberg era. Like there's been a lot of misuses of data in just the field of social justice and policing. I'm curious if you've seen any progress made there and sort of how that can be used to further inform the debates about police reform, defunding police, and sort of the events of, the past year with George Floyd, for example. What examples do you look to now of how this data is being used for good and how practitioners are carrying that work forward?
Yeah, Greg, thanks so much for bringing that up because I think it's important on a number of levels. Like one, for those of you guys who don't know, I have a project that I did with Laura Kurgan and Eric Kadora that looks at the cost of incarceration. And what we did is we took a database of where people lived before they were in prison. And then we added it up block by block. And we found many blocks. We spent over $1 million to incarcerate people from those blocks. But we're not addressing the systemic issues at play in those neighborhoods. So why can't we spend $1 million on education or reentry programs or job training programs or the things that would help reduce incarceration rates and kind of really trying to use data visualization to expose how we spend money on areas of poverty. It's a lot easier to put people in prison in a way than to actually deal with the systems. But I think what's important about that project is, we've done that. We did that way back. And it was really about how can we use an image and visualization to bring this complex ideas to broad publics. And what I find fascinating is, some of what we're talking about is exactly the idea of defunding the police. I don't think we called it defunding the police at that time, but more, how can we reallocate money to other systems that really can help a problem, right? And that's, at the essence, what defunding the police is about. But I think what's also interesting is I've seen those maps that were made almost like 15 years ago in presentations right now about defunding the police. I've seen them in presentations about closing Rikers Island. I've seen them. And I think that what it really says is the power of image to change and influence people's minds. And that's really what's exciting about data visualization and communicating with data. Also, it can be alarming because it's so powerful, right, as a tool. But in this case, I think it's a powerful tool in terms of helping people think of new ways of approaching a problem. I think what's also interesting about it is exactly as you say, we typically look at crime maps in a very different way, right? In that we're trying to hotspot crimes and send police to those locations. And rather than thinking about, the opposite way of, how do we stop the problems that perhaps cause crime? I think there is very also like really interesting way that the ACLU used stop and frisk data, same way, turning a formal data set made by the criminal justice system and then using it to advocate for a removal of, a very problematic and racist policy.
Interesting. Well, going back in time for a bit, I mean, the abuses of data by cities is definitely not a new practice. And I was thinking here and discussing some of this about sort of, NewCities got started 10 years ago during the smart cities discourse, which, had has all sorts of problems in it. What's sort of the legacy of how cities have misused data and sort of, how this sort of movement goes back, if, at least decades. I think of John Lindsay, for example, using RAND data with, to reallocate firehouses, which of course led to thousands upon thousands of homes burning, for example. What do you look back at as sort of like, what were some of the worst mistakes of how cities use data, and how can we rectify those going forward? What are the practices we should be doing? Because you're right, like the heat map itself as a device, of course, fueled policy changes. I'm curious if there's other examples of like misuse of data or misreading of data that's led to these sort of disastrous policy outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one example that we always hear, right, is the homeowners loan insurance maps, right, that created redlining. But I would actually say that there is a precursor to that that people that are not aware of. So if you're not aware of these redlining maps, they're maps that were created by the home loan insurance agency to figure out who can get mortgages, right? And they often marked red African American neighborhoods, which really caused disinvestment. But I would say that those maps are based on previous maps by an individual, Harlan Bartholomew, and he really, I guess, is the leader of the technocratic planning movement that really started around the turn of the century. And he was hired in St. Louis in 1915 for the sole purpose of creating a new zoning map that would be exclusionary. And it's very explicit by the Business Bureau to exclude people because they could no longer segregate based on race. Because in 1917, the Supreme Court made racial segregation zoning based on race illegal. So the St. Louis Business Bureau hired Harlan Bartholomew to create a new zoning plan. And what he did is he collected extensive data. He went door to every location in St. Louis. And then he drew zoning maps that would exclude African American communities by making them zoned for brothels or manufacturing or other kinds of, let's say, like problematic uses that are not in line with a residential neighborhood, and then made it so that they can no longer have residents built, thereby kind of marginalizing them. Those neighborhoods that he did that in St. Louis, Harlan Bartholomew did 563 plans in the United States. Like, his effect on segregation in American cities is huge, and we often don't look at that. And at the core, he used data and his method. And in fact, he has a book called Land Use Planning that was used at Harvard and for planners like way into the 60s. And so this process of rezoning, data analysis, and using it for exclusion had huge effects on our cities and are the basis for those homeowners insurance maps at their very heart. So you see the neighborhoods that he's rezoned then become these redlining districts. And I think what's interesting about Harlan Bartholomew is in his papers, and I know this in the book, he's very explicit about what he's doing. There's no question about whether he was racist or not. He actually says, I want to exclude Black people from these areas in the city. And probably why St. Louis has been the center for so much of this contention. And, data can be looked back at doing that.
That is,
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
That's where I would say that's remarkable, particularly in light of, we had at our housing conference this past summer, we did a screening and discussion of the Pruitt-Igoe myth. It's funny that
Yeah.
architecture as a profession focuses on the failures of public housing when really, St. Louis was devastated by deindustrialization. I had never heard of this particular story. I had no idea that, basically blockbusting through data and zoning as well and those kinds of uses. But
Well, it's really interesting, because if you'll trace these neighborhoods, and particularly in St. Louis, you see first this exclusionary zoning, then African Americans can't get a mortgage anymore. So they might have been like middle class neighborhoods. It actually blights those neighborhoods. Those blighted neighborhoods are now have evidence to be removed. And then, the business district can put whatever they want. So it's kind of this, really systematic removal that obviously still is marked on the landscape today. And Pruitt-Igoe is definitely one of these areas. It's a really good example of that.
Yeah, well, that's a great historical antecedent. Then going back to the present now, of course, why African American communities in Detroit and elsewhere have been the most vocally resistant to video surveillance, facial recognition, other sort of advanced data monitoring tools. I want to go back to how we should do best practices on this. I think for a long time I used some of my slides in discussing about lightweight ways of collecting data. Your benchmark experiment, right, of creating a wooden bench with some basic sensors to track movement that we could understand how people use spaces. It struck me as more in line with what Holly White would have wanted when he was using cameras to capture people. What are the principles that practitioners should use to actually collect data? What is a safe and good way to collect data and then to use it that is not basically capture everything, and then basically use it to surveil people? How's your own thinking on this evolved, and what sort of experiments are you looking to next as a way of proactively doing this?
Super good question, and really important as we move to this, increasing amounts of data. In the book, I create 7 principles for data action, and I think at the heart of it, and the first principle is really do no harm and interrogate the reasons we want to use data and determine the potential for the work to do more harm than good. So really at the heart of any data practice, you have to do that. Of course, in that is critiquing others in that same light, right? In that, what is the intention that you have for making this data analysis? What do you hope to get? And what is the intention of the person that's making it, right? Because no matter what, we bring our biases, our past experiences to the work that we do. And data is exactly the same. It represents the ideologies of the person who makes it. And so at the very heart, we should question ourselves, what are our purposes in doing this, but those of others. But I think in terms of building data itself and collecting and making new data, I think it's really important to do that by building teams and diverse teams, right? So let's take Sidewalk Labs example of, that kind of didn't work, right? What's that?
I was hoping we'd get to Sidewalk Labs.
Yeah, right. So the idea that they were going to, have cameras and surveillance, and I think they really could have done a better job by really including community members, the city, the stakeholders of people who might want to use that data in the conversations of actually how to build it and what to collect, for a number of reasons. They could build trust within the community for why these exist, right? I think there was no real answer to what the data was going to be used for. So then you're just going to mistrust it, right? Or no real evidence for how it might benefit the community. So, but also by excluding them, it creates a huge amount of suspicion, right? And in that exclusion, you just automatically assume potential malfeasance or harm, I guess, in a way. And so I think when we build data together, it's important to bring all of the stakeholders together in the process, but also be transparent, right, about what's being collected, how it's being collected, but also giving the community access to it, I think, as well. But I think, it's interesting because I think it's good to have a relationship, cities to have a relationship with private organizations that do this work, but that relationship, needs to be more inclusive, right? And both include conversations with the city and the community. And I think that in the case of Sidewalk Labs, it wasn't done well. And the city, in a way, lost control. And when they lose control, that is a huge problem for the public, right? Because they're meant to, be protecting our rights, hopefully.
No, yeah, we had Bianca Wiley on here as a previous guest, so we had a
Yeah.
discussion there about sort of, ultimately Waterfront Toronto was to blame for that, for writing a not an airtight RFP. But going back to that, I mean, one of the things that Sidewalk talked a lot about, or others talked about, was the notion of data trust, right? And I guess as a final question here, or topic for discussion is how should we think about data as a public good, or as a good unto itself, right? There's all sorts of proposals warmed over about people owning their data and selling it to data exchanges. And then, of course, there's the notion that it should be a public good and should be kept in trust by somebody, government or some sort of third-party institution. And again, I'm curious, in the book and your own experience is, have we made any progress on that front in terms of thinking about how data should be collected, stored, valued, and assigned, the kind of thing like that?
Yeah. No, I think this is one of the things that I say at the end of the book is this is the biggest thing that we need to work towards is, understanding like the ownership of data. And I guess like an example of this is like, right, like, if you think about Sidewalk Labs, right, we're asking them to self-regulate, right, to come up with the privacy policy, the ways that it can be used appropriately, who can use it, right? And it's really not to their benefit to create those regulations, right? But we're asking them to self-regulate. On the other side, government doesn't want to regulate because it's not in their benefit to do so for a number of reasons. It's not in their benefit because they benefit from having access to that data or buying it. They also, are largely against like regulating big tech companies because they're losing power control. And so in, government's lack of ability to regulate and then asking Sidewalk Labs to regulate. And I should note that the government doesn't want to regulate because they don't want to get it wrong, right? like they don't, and so there's a lot of reasons. I think there's this huge gap, and this is where we really need to be working towards creating mechanisms in which we protect our data. Perhaps a data trust is one example. But I do think that cities need to take a stronger hand in terms of working with companies like Sidewalk Labs, in terms of they've often lost control of their data because they're totally putting it out to private companies, right? But it's a weird issue because they want to do that because they don't want to get sued for using that data improperly, right? Like, so they benefit in a way from not being in control of that data. But then at other times they're really disadvantaged because then they don't have access or can't control how it's used or even can't stop the control of it. So we're in this like big space in the middle right now. I know this doesn't sound sexy, but like I've always thought about this, like, having this lobby company that really explains to government why it's important to create kind of more protections and like that it can also create innovation because, there's so much data that private companies have that can be used for a public good. But in the fact that we're missing that space, we can't access that data for a public good. So it's this kind of a really important space that I think we need to work on in the next decade. I think that getting back to your I could just talk about public good forever. Obviously, it's one chapter.
A question on that, or a way to weld it in there. You mentioned Kathy O'Neill and weapons of mass destruction at the outset. I mean, she created a company, Orca, that's basically doing algorithmic auditing. And I'm curious if you've ever been tempted, or like what other kind of institutions we need like that. Should there be a clearinghouse to take that data, cleanse it, anonymize it, and put it out to good uses in the world, kind of thing like that. Or, or to do kind of auditing of the mechanisms for collection of these kinds of things. Are there any other examples that inspire you, I guess, or sort of point to where we should be going with this?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of conversation of like this idea of data intermediaries, right? So whether they're data collectors, they're kind of third party, they're not in the government, and they're not, they're not in the private companies where that data gets put into these data intermediaries. They make sure that it's aggregated and then kind of redistributed. I think that's a really important idea because I do think it's hard for a company to regulate themselves and know, the best intention and for that data set. And I think data intermediaries could really help us tap into so much of the public good of that data set that you can that exists. And I feel like if you think about it, you could go back to electricity and what happened as we started to electrify the country, right? Like you have this public good that does need some kind of parameters, regulation, kind of, but you also, it's a business, right? And I think if we start thinking about, other infrastructure in the past in which we've needed kind of an intermediary between government and the private companies, we could really benefit from, I mean, I feel like as autonomous vehicles come out, this is going to be so much more important because we're really creating a second world every second, and that world, I mean, world is a weird word for it, but that space is going to be like the internet. You can plug into it for all kinds of things, right? Plug into it, whether is somebody who's blind putting their earphones on and walking through the city now, or it's providing you information, about things to buy or read. I mean, it's going to be a profit generating infrastructure, along the lines of the internet. So these data intermediaries are going to be very important.
Yeah, the digital twin discourse is fascinating that way unto itself, right? And sort of, whether it's government or companies building these digital twins of the real world.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I think it's about all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah. It's been a pleasure. I know we could talk about this all day, and I best of luck with the book.
Thank you so much for having me and letting me talk about my book. I mean, I'm so excited that it's finally out, and just really hope that people can use it to be optimism. We are at an optimistic time. I want us to be, right? We're on the course of having a vaccine. We have a new electoral body. And so how can we be optimistic in the way we use data in the future too? Thank you so much.
That's an excellent note to end on. So thank you so much for joining us, Sarah. Thank you all so much for watching. This is our last episode for 2020. So enjoy your well-deserved holiday break at the end of a pandemic year. And we'll be back in 2021 with an all new format and new guests. And we'll see you then. So thank you so much for watching.